It was said that he had a sluggish hand. On the other hand, Eric Clapton's temper is everything from slow and steady. In the background of the silky licks and classic ballads, there is a man who is not only infamous for reinventing blues rock, but also for having conflicts with some of the most prominent figures in the history of music. These were not merely disparities in creative expression. These feuds were fueled by jealousy, ego, betrayal, and in some cases downright hatred. They were deep-seated and caused a great deal of pain. It was Clapton's silent rage that formed the undercurrent of rock's golden period. It manifested itself in a variety of ways, from stolen lovers and public insults to backstage meltdowns and lifetime grudges. Some people believe that the riffs became more pointed as the rivalry became more unpleasant. There was a disagreement that transformed a studio session into a battlefield, and that is where everything started. Phil Collins is the master of the pop puppet genre. It was never Eric Clapton's intention to become a famous pop star. To the Deutsche very core, he was a blues musician, distinctive, heartfelt, and unfiltered. Nevertheless, Phil Collins attempted to recast that image during the glossy, synth-driven haze of the middle of the 1880s, and it came dangerously close to tearing Clapton apart. For the most part, it appeared that their partnership would be fruitful. Collins, who was at the pinnacle of his fame with Genesis and was also having a successful solo career at the time, joined Clapton's team to produce music for his album Behind the Sun, which was released in 1985. Even more impressively, he contributed his signature studio gloss by playing drums on many tracks. It was a marketing match made in heaven for the record label where it was being used. Clapton, on the other hand, was experiencing a psychological and creative crisis. All of these elements, including the radio-friendly mixes, the bright keyboards, and the sleek production, were in direct opposition to his creative essence. On his own record, Clapton experienced a sense of being an outsider. Reportedly, he vented his frustrations to a buddy behind closed doors, saying, "I felt like I was being packaged and transported. I do not identify with that." It was never the case. The tensions increased. Collins was a hitmaker at heart, and he advocated for catchy compositions that were intended to break through on the pop charts. Every step was met with resistance from Clapton, who was still holding to his blues roots. Both Collins and Clapton were often at odds with one another in the studio, with Collins arguing for a wider audience appeal and Clapton being concerned that he was selling out. Then came Live Aid, the global concert that took place in 1985 and was broadcast to millions of people. Clapton and Collins gave the impression of being unified on stage. In the background, a storm is gathering momentum. According to those with knowledge of the situation, there was a heated argument regarding the set list. Deep blues cuts that were honest and emotional were what Clapton desired. Collins was adamant about having tracks that were polished to the point where they would wow the global audience that was watching him on television. There was a suffocating amount of pressure to conform. Later on, Clapton would look back on this time period with resentment, seeing it as an era in which he sacrificed his soul in order to achieve chart success. During the time that Collins was riding the wave of mainstream popularity to greater fame, Clapton quietly removed himself from the spotlight in order to rediscover the music that had once defined him. They were never able to fully repair their connection. Many fans and blues purists accused Clapton of losing his authenticity, which was a criticism leveled against the album by critics who criticized its excessive production. The entire ordeal left him with a sour taste in his mouth, and it would continue to torment him for many years to come. Just wait till you see what happens when Clapton is forced to play in a band with someone he can't even look in the eye. If you thought the tension that exists over musical identity was severe, you should wait until you witness what occurs. A drummer from hell, Ginger Baker is a drummer. Behind the scenes, Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker were a slow-motion implosion, waiting to happen despite the fact that they were outstanding performers on stage. As two-thirds of the iconic supergroup Cream, they were responsible for creating a sound that was the epitome of rock in the late 1960s. earthy, raucous, and powerful. Their battles were just as famous as their solos, and their performances were spectacular, despite the fact that their egos were also just as explosive. Their relationship was unstable from the very beginning of their time together. However, Clapton could not bear Baker himself, despite the fact that he loved Baker's drumming techniques. On the other side, Baker regarded Clapton as having a feeble will and being overly quick to give in to the pressures of the commercial world. There was a rapid increase in the tension. Prior to a significant performance, Clapton once confided in a member of the crew, "If I depart, then he will go as well." That wasn't just idle chatter. When he was ready, he walked. Before Cream started on their final tour in 1968, the situation had already reached a point where it was almost toxic. Clapton and Baker were nearly impossible to be in the same room together. In order to avoid a confrontation between the two, several sessions were recorded at studios that were completely different from one another. Even on stage, simmering beneath the surface was the animosity that was present. Amid the performance, glares were exchanged, and there was a chilly stillness during intervals. Despite this, the band continued to move forward, and it is strange to think that their hatred may have been a contributing factor to the immense impact of their music. The hatred and scorn that they felt poured over into their playing, giving songs like White Room and Sunshine of Your Love a tense and electric edge that very few bands were able to reproduce for themselves. Clapton, however, was adamant that he would have no further interaction with Baker after Cream officially broke up. Throughout the years, fans have been hoping for a reunion, but Eric has repeatedly and unequivocally rejected the idea whenever Ginger was involved. He referred to Baker as a loose cannon and a nightmare in human form in private chats. Baker was a nightmare in human form. In 2005, when they did eventually perform together for a short period of time, those who were in the know described the atmosphere as being solely professional. It was just two men tolerating each other for the sake of nostalgia. There was no laughter, no affection, and nothing else. Baker, who was never one to tolerate silence, asserted at a later time, "Eric was afraid of me. He was aware that I was the superior musician." Insiders claim that Clapton never publicly addressed that jab, but that it simply served to further split the two groups. As a result of their collaboration, something truly legendary was born. However, the price was a relationship that was so poisonous that it could not be repaired. And just when you thought the musical tension couldn't possibly grow any colder, Eric encountered a man who not only disagreed with him, but also derided all that he stood for. The album, War of the Weirdos, by Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was the heretic who came to bring down the temple of blues rock heritage if Eric Clapton was the high priest of blues rock tradition. Destruction of musical conventions was Zappa's life's work. Unapologetically strange, he was also adventurous and provocative in his behavior. To him, Clapton's commitment to the blues was not an example of artistic skill. Stagnation was the result. In an interview that took place in 1978, Zappa did not draw any punches. The guitarist Eric Clapton is a reliable performer. No art exists, and there is no risk. There was more to that than criticism. It was an insult that was directed specifically at Clapton's conscience. Eric was enraged, as he had already grown tired of those who questioned his position in the world. An acquaintance of his is said to have heard him say, "Frank Zappa's music is nothing more than noise wrapped in ego. There is no significance to any of it." This war of words, however, was not a new one. Over the course of almost a decade, their hostility had been building up. Zappa is said to have wanted to perform right before Clapton at the Love and Peace Festival in 1969. He was aware that Clapton's experimental and chaotic act would be extremely difficult to follow. With a sneer on his face, Zappa informed the team, "Let's see him give it another shot after that." However, Clapton, who was outraged but also calculated, did not take the bait in public, but he was seething in private. Zappa did not appear to him to be a visionary. The man was a clown who played the guitar. According to Clapton, Zappa's music, was purposefully incomprehensible, and he considered it to be a mockery of musicianship rather than a product of it. However, Zappa continued to poke the bear. It was in interviews that he made fun of Clapton's solos, referring them as pentatonic exercises, and implying that he had been using the same licks for a decade. In response, Clapton referred to Zappa as unlistenable, asserting that no one he respected genuinely appreciated the music that Zappa created. However, a more profound rift was present beneath the jabs. Tradition, emotion, and the unfiltered nature of blues music were all things that Clapton valued. Zappa was a firm believer in breaking down artistic limits, destroying established structures, and completely reprogramming music. This feud between them was about more than simply money. The conflict was intellectual in nature, a miniature version of rock's struggle between his roots and his rebellious side. Clapton continued to maintain his silence even after Michael Zappa passed away in 1993. A close acquaintance of his is said to have heard him say, "I have nothing to say about him that wouldn't be inappropriate." It was a chilly conclusion to a conflict that had never been resolved. The following feud, however, would cut right through Clapton's personal life and inflict scars that he would be unable to conceal if Zappa's challenges were found to be particularly severe. In the bloodstream, Keith Richards's treason was discovered. It was the perfect example. Doug's treachery, ego, and a woman who ruined more than just a friendship are all things that are discussed in this article. Keith Richards and Eric Clapton were never really close together. The situation, however, became quite explosive when Clapton made a move that even the most outrageous rock artists were unable to swallow. It was eventually determined that he would choose Pattie Boyd, who was married to George Harrison. Richards was not merely shocked. He was enraged by the situation. The activities of Clapton were referred to as a snake move by him, and he publicly questioned his moral compass and allegiance. Keith did not view it as merely a romantic relationship. It was a matter of honor among the companions. In addition, he believed that Clapton had unraveled the mystery. In a short amount of time, the musical tension arrived. Clapton, who has always been a purist of blues music, thought that Richards' raw technique was sloppy and unfocused. According to reports, he referred to Keith's guitar work as being lazy and a mess. In response, Richards responded to Clapton in interviews, describing him as someone who was predictable, uninteresting, and completely overrated. Following that, the D-Rugs appeared. Both men were in the throes of addiction in the 1970s, but rather of coming together to share their demons, they turned against each other and became antagonistic against one another. Richards asserted that Clapton was using heroin as a cover for his actions. He allegedly informed a bandmate, "Eric hides behind drugs," and the bandmate believed him. Clapton, who was not one to take criticism in silence, retorted angrily. Over the course of 20 years, Keith has been playing the same 5 riffs. The group of people they shared a common buddy circle was caught in the crossfire. At one time, the situation became so severe that social gatherings had to be divided into 2 distinct groups, both with Clapton and Richards, one with each other. There was a covert effort made by promoters and producers to ensure that they were not scheduled on the same festivals. It was not just tension that existed. There existed a genuine animosity. The resentment, however, extended beyond matters of personal slights. Richards, who had always been a renegade, believed that Clapton had conceded defeat. It is very polished and calculated. Clapton regarded Richards as a mess, a volatile individual who lacked discipline and was overrated. They were engaged in a fierce, long-lasting, and intensely personal competition that had its origins not just in treachery, but also in pride. There are 2 legends who are perpetually encircling each other with their teeth clenched and their silence icy. If the previous quarrel was the result of betrayal and ego, then the subsequent one was the result of something far more sinister, the crippling anxiety of being replaced by someone else. This was the crown that Jimmy Page was unable to reclaim. Eric Clapton was previously considered the untouchable guitar king of Britain, and he was worshipped as a god by both graffiti artists and fans. On the other hand, a man finally arrived who did not only dispute his throne, he destroyed it by setting fire to it. There was a man named Jimmy Page. Page reimagined what it meant to be a guitar hero by utilizing his dark mystique, violin bows, and booming riffs in his music. Just a band, Led Zeppelin was more than that. In mythology, it was a powerful force, besides Clapton. In an instant, he appeared out of date, and left behind. Behind closed doors, the jealousy was building up. During a replay session, Clapton was heard sneering, according to the memory of one studio engineer. Jimmy conceals himself and uses studio trickery. I want to watch him perform that live. Page, on the other hand, is capable of performing it, live, and much more. The albums released by Zeppelin ruled the charts. Their tours were so successful that arenas all around the world were completely booked out. When their legacy began to explode, it was stated that Clapton refused to read any story that made a comparison between the two stars. Deep down, he was aware of the truth. The throne has moved slightly. Paul Samuel Smith, a former bandmate of the Yardbirds, provided a scathing dose of truth to summarize the situation. Taking over the band that Eric had left behind, Jimmy turned it into a legendary band that haunted Eric. Indeed, the wound never fully recovered. In subsequent interviews, Clapton made veiled references to Page, describing his sound as smart with effects but missing soul. Claudio Clapton was referred to as a man who was stuck in the past by Page, who answered with a contemptuous shrug. This was not merely a juxtaposition of styles. The struggle for rock immortality was a fierce one. There was a clinging to the traditional blues culture. Rock's journey into another universe was initiated by the other, and the higher Page rose, the more Clapton felt like he was being overshadowed. Competition was not the only factor. It turned into a fixation on it, a timely reminder that the individual who was previously referred to as God might be outdone. The final rivalry, however, was the one that not only shook Clapton's self-assurance, but also damaged his fundamental sense of who he was. Jimi Hendrix, the day that Clapton was dethroned from his position. It was a night in 1966 that was filled with electric energy, and ever since then, Eric Clapton has never been the same. Having established himself as the undisputed king of British guitarists, he entered a smoky club in London. Having the swagger, the praise, and the reverent nickname God, he was a powerhouse. Nevertheless, Jimi Hendrix appeared on stage and in the span of a single set, rewrote the rules of the guitar. This took place under the dark lights. Claudio stood there in utter disbelief. During the time when Hendrix was tearing through his set, as he was playing behind his back with his teeth and setting the strings on fire, Eric murmured to a friend, "It's over," in a manner that was both symbolic and almost literally actual. "It's over with me." During the middle of the event, he reportedly exited, looking pale and shaking. The individual who was revered for his gentle and soulful bends had recently witnessed the future of music, which was louder, faster, and unabashedly crazy. It was the purity of blues that Clapton had constructed his world around. Hendrix gave it an old-fashioned feel. It was behind closed doors that Eric developed an obsession. He examined Jimmy's licks, emulated his tones, and even practiced his stage appearance in order to improve his performance. However, when he was in public, he adopted a different tone, rejecting Hendrix's brilliance as noise that was excessively expressive. In a later statement, Pete Townshend, another guitar legend, expressed it rather plainly. The loss of the throne was too much for Eric to bear. However, he did not. The concerts that Clapton attended by Hendrix were no longer held. According to his buddies, he would switch the radio station if Jimmy were to come on. It was not merely a competition. Rather, it was a crisis. It wasn't enough for Hendrix to outplay him. He had completely taken his place. Fans from all across the world expressed their sorrow upon Jimi's untimely passing in 1970. Clapton, on the other hand, did not speak, neither an homage nor a criticism of any kind. Years later, in a rare instance of honesty, he admitted something that no one had anticipated he would say. Relief came over me. Never before had the feud been verbalized. Although there were no interviews or disc recordings, the harm was much more extensive than any headline could have depicted. Not only did Hendrix outperform Clapton, but he also destroyed the very identity that Eric had built his career on. Even after Hendrix had passed away, the shade that he had thrown over Clapton never completely disappeared. Because there are times when the most excruciating rivalries are those in which your greatest adversary never showed any form of hatred against you. It was not merely a matter of competition. They reflected Clapton himself in a way that was unique. His fears, his pride, and his desire to achieve greatness all existed. The myth of the untouchable guitar god was gradually dismantled by each dispute, which revealed the man that lay underneath, the surface. Brave, wounded, and frequently at odds with his own legend, he was proud, mainly due to the fact that the most powerful solos are born out of suffering. In addition, Clapton's anguish was not only shown via his songs, but also through the shattered friendships, cruel words, and music that reverberates with unresolved bitterness.